Labor, as you can understand now, was really central to the construct of apartheid. Africans are actually only seen as labor units by the apartheid state, and they're only allowed access into urban areas for work, more or less. And they either, if they don't have a job, they actually are, it's illegal for them to occupy urban areas. Even though corporate codes of conduct were operating in the interest of capital, and within this capitalist system as a way to kind of uphold capitalism, they were also, unwillingly providing a space for workers to challenge and leverage a system to kind of challenge capital. There were activists and trade unionists who were thinking in these broader class unity terms. Kind of cite the name of your podcast here. Apartheid actually doesn't serve the interest of anyone in the working class, even if that includes white workers themselves. But of course, that's not exactly how it played out more broadly. It was very difficult for white workers and Black workers to kind of form alliances because the apartheid state divided them along these racial lines. The executive order, from at least what I can see, the South African side, is actually served to unite South Africans. The president, Ramaphosa, has been able to use it as a way to rally around the flag or call for South Africans to kind of support each other against foreign interference in kind of their own livelihoods. I think the effect has been not exactly what Donald Trump and Elon Musk were hoping for. It's actually brought South Africans who are quite divided politically closer together and to kind of show a united front against the United States and what they see as kind of Donald Trump's overreach and Elon Musk's attempt to kind of exacerbate existing racial tensions within the country.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Class Unity discussion. Today, we'll be talking about the politics of labor, race, and sanctions in apartheid South Africa with Mattie Webb, who is a postdoctoral associate at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs. Thanks for joining us, Mattie.
Thanks for having me.
So just to get started, could we start with a broad overview of the history of apartheid South Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just kind of start with the term apartheid itself. This term literally means apartness in Afrikaans and essentially is an institutionalized form of racial segregation that was implemented by the ruling National Party in South Africa in 1948. And I don't want to delve into too much of a backstory, but it was very much a policy that built on an earlier era of segregation in South Africa that had, developed since the early industrialization of the country, the founding of gold and diamonds in the Witwatersrand as well as Kimberley, which are two regions of South Africa. And then it, gradually race relations got worse and worse. Around 1913 was the Natives Land Act, which effectively, again, this is before the apartheid policy was implemented. The Natives Land Act effectively began the process of forced removals and relocation of each racial group into certain sections of the country. And then, of course, 1948, apartheid was able to build on this earlier policy of racial segregation and division, and eventually came to rule the entire country. It's a very draconian system that banned opposition, made every single race in South Africa effectively enemies of each other. This included the African population, which was the great majority of the South African population. And then there's also the colored population. This is a term that is derogatory in the US context, but is, has a long and very complex history within South Africa itself. And, I'm happy to explain in more detail, but just for the sake of, simplicity, the colored population refers to either people of mixed race or those who are descendants of the native Khoisan people. And then finally, there's the Indian population. And all of these are legally registered racial categories that, each experienced apartheid in their own unique ways. So the apartheid state divided them and forced them to kind of work against each other. And in general, uh, required, for example, through a number of individual policies, such as the Population Registration Act, required um, individuals to carry passbooks, which was essentially a passport that restricted those members of certain groups from entering other areas unless they were there for work. This policy ultimately, in the 1970s, reached, I would say, kind of its highest stage of grand apartheid, quote unquote, which included the actual creation of independent African states within South Africa. And this is sort of where I think our understanding of apartheid from an American perspective gets a little bit more complicated. We often think of apartheid in parallel with racial segregation in the US South, but this policy that was implemented, well, envisioned in the 1950s and 1960s, but actually fully implemented or began to be implemented in the 1970s, really separates, I would say, apartheid in the South African context from segregation in the US South. So um, essentially, what happened was the South African government decided to create these independent African quote unquote homelands where they would forcibly remove Black Africans and relocate them to roughly 13, these areas that accounted for roughly 13% of the area of South Africa, often the worst land, really far from kind of urban areas, um, often not arable. And those who lived there often had to migrate into the cities for work. So this is labor, as you can understand now, was really central to the construct of apartheid. Africans are actually only seen as labor units by the apartheid state, and they're only allowed access into urban areas for work, more or less. And they either, if they don't have a job, they actually are, it's illegal for them to occupy urban areas. So again, I hope that kind of explains some of the background to apartheid and maybe like distills some of the differences between apartheid and segregation. I'm happy to kind of explain more, but skipping ahead a few years, apartheid does end in a legal sense in 1994, but thereafter, there's a lot of debates currently over did apartheid end, or was it replaced by a different form of, racial capitalism that has kind of continued to keep, portions of uh, Black South Africans in kind of this permanent underclass state. So, yeah, I'm happy to explain in more detail, but I hope that kind of gives everyone a decent background.
Yeah, thank you. Your research focuses on uh, labor and the union movement and foreign policy as well. But could you tell us more about the significance of the labor movement as it relates to the apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement?
Sure. So I guess one other thing I should probably mention too, in explaining the background of South African history and apartheid is, I was discussing essentially what apartheid looked like and the general kind of legal structure. But of course, there were countervailing forces that were challenging it. As you mentioned, the labor union movement is central to my work, but this also connects to the broader liberation movement and the struggle against apartheid. So that's represented by groups like the ANC, the African National Congress, and the PAC, the Pan Africanist Congress. And the ANC, to just kind of like connect to the trade union movement, the ANC was closely aligned with one particular federation called SACTU, South African Congress of Trade Unions. And I'll do my best with this, but honestly, there's a lot of acronyms in South African trade union history. So,
Sure.
stop me if it's getting a little confusing. A lot of them sound really similar too. So, SACTU, I think, is an important one to know just because it was aligned with the ANC and was similarly repressed like the ANC was in the 1960s. So we have SAC2. There's also other trade unions that are formed in this kind of earlier apartheid era. There's a white trade union federation called SACL, and there's also a kind of um, mixed trade union federation called TUCSA, the Trade Union Congress of South Africa. And as you can see, the union federations are often somewhat divided on racial lines. SAC2 obviously is the only one that is really actually representing African workers at this time. And there's lots of tensions kind of between these federations, but also between trade union movements and African liberation movements more broadly. They kind of have different visions for how apartheid might come to an end. And what I do with my work is I try to put these movements, these federations, the livelihoods of South African workers on the ground in conversation with trade union movements and resistance movements in the United States, as well as globally. But my work is very much focused on the United States and the South African relationship. So, so I'm happy to kind of unpack more of that for you. I think there's a lot of key moments, of rupture and of change that occur as, we get closer and closer to the 1970s and the 1980s, where the challenges to apartheid are becoming a little bit more salient.
I mean, the impression I got from reading your articles is that globalization seems to have played a large role in just changing the labor conditions within South Africa in a way that may have been conducive towards, desegregation in the workplace and so forth. Can you talk more about just that global relationship, or even, I mean, specifically like the relationship between America and South Africa? Because it seems like on the one hand, American corporations were now interested in South Africa, which led to things like the Sullivan principles, as you describe in your article. But then there's also the globalization of the union movement. So I'm just wondering, how do you characterize that transnational dimension to this, and whether is this like I mean, this could be framed as like a triumph of globalization from a certain standpoint. I'm sure we would maybe want to resist that, given our group's nature, but I wonder if there's any truth to that.
Yeah, it's really important to kind of think about how this relates to globalization, or the story of US-South African relations relates to globalization more broadly. And I think by using, at least in my own work, by centering to some extent the corporation itself and as a space where apartheid could be actually challenged, and where individuals, workers on the ground could actually draw connections globally and understand shared notions of oppression. Uh, that in itself is really central to my argument. Of course, I also try to further contextualize this understanding of globalization and the role of US corporations by infusing these bottom-up perspectives of considering, not just as historians have kind of studied US corporations and their role in US empire, but also looking at how that was challenged from the bottom up. So one argument that I try to complicate more or less is this understanding of US corporations and their signing of the Sullivan Principles and workplace codes of conduct as mere corporate camouflage. Of course, I'm not arguing that the Sullivan Principles or corporate codes were effective, and I'm not trying to kind of celebrate these, sort of symbolic notions of anti-apartheid, of challenges to kind of the global uh, to global empire, but saying that actually, even though corporate codes of conduct were operating in the interest of capital, and within this capitalist system as a way to kind of uphold capitalism, they were also kind of against, unwillingly providing a space for workers to challenge and leverage a system to kind of challenge capital. I'm essentially taking everything a bit, a step further and not just looking at how corporations, were very, or how corporations and corporate codes of conduct were just mere corporate camouflage. I'm saying that actually, if we look at them from the perspective of workers, we get an entirely different story. But of course, this all, if you're thinking about globalization in South Africa more broadly, um, I I think this is essential. The story is essential in understanding the dynamics of globalization. But I also think that to some extent, to tell a more complete story, you would almost have to go back to the 1920s when US corporations were actually um, entering South Africa and taking advantage of what was already considered very cheap Black labor, ultimately boost their earnings more broadly. So, yeah, I'm happy to explain more of that in detail, but I think that's kind of how I see my story is contributing to the broader literature and understanding of US corporations as, um, potential conduits of empire.
I'm curious about who you think are the major players involved in the story of South African apartheid, and uh, specifically who benefited from apartheid and who was hurt. I mean, one like very obvious way to see apartheid, especially if you're relating it to like narratives around race relations in the United States, is sort of uh, whites and blacks, whites, as a group oppressing the black population and benefiting from it overall. I don't know if I would, I don't think I would agree with that characterization, at least of American politics. I don't think, like, I would be very skeptical to the extent to which white working class people or white poor people really benefited from um, those race relations. So, I mean, I'm curious about your opinion in South Africa, South African whites or blacks or other races, um, government institutions, corporations. Uh, who were the ones that were benefiting from apartheid, and who were the ones that um, that weren't?
Yeah, it's an important question, and I think it's obvious sometimes that, it's easy to say that white people universally benefited from apartheid. And I think that to some extent that is true, but there obviously is an element of class. But it doesn't, the way that class falls on racial lines in South Africa is is different from the United States. Even within even within the white population itself, if you're looking at, say, just metrics like worker pay, and income, and the types of roles that workers were allowed access to within their own jobs, you see that even the lowest paid white worker is paid more than the highest paid Black worker, or really anyone of any of the other racial categories. So this is throughout most of the apartheid era, universally true. To kind of complicate your question, obviously, the poorest white workers themselves, or the least skilled white workers, are still, the way apartheid works, it still does draw a wedge between them and the most wealthy white workers. So there are still tensions, and I think that that is actually really central to our understanding of these reform policies that I'm happy to explain in more detail, like the Vihan Commission. There's some arguments by a couple scholars that really advance this idea that the government's reform of apartheid, by way of allowing some Black workers to, advance into higher positions, that in itself is a way that the South African government sacrificed the kind of poorest of white workers. Said that, okay, as long as we can, as wealthy Afrikaners, if we can maintain, if we feel like we're being challenged, we can actually maintain our privileged position by sacrificing the lowest white workers, and saying that, oh, it's okay if certain Black workers ultimately advance and get paid more. I'm okay with, the poorest of poor white workers being in potentially a worse off position than before. And so some of these reforms were creative in that, from the perspective of the South African ruling class, and that they were able to uh, kind of neatly sacrifice some of the less privileged, if we're talking in class terms, like the less privileged workers for the kind of continued advancement and privileged position of the bourgeoisie and kind of the working or in the privileged classes within South Africa. So kind of to like put it into kind of class terms, but also layering it with race. It's very complicated, but I think it's indisputable that in the context of South African history, that the African worker is always in the lowest position. And there's plenty of data to support this. They're actually not even considered workers until the Vihan Commission amends the Industrial Conciliation Act in the late 70s, early 80s. So they completely lack access to basic protections and don't even have the right to form, trade unions. I mean, they can form unions, but they perhaps are not going to be recognized or able to fully bargain with management. So that outlines a few of, I guess, the existing tensions and some of kind of the complications between racial classes, between race and class in South African history. But again, I'm kind of happy to elaborate a little bit more because there's obviously various other groups that I think do benefit uniquely from apartheid, as well as groups that actually, firmly challenge apartheid during this period.
Thanks, Mattie, for talking to us. I just did a quick follow-up question based on some of what you were saying now. So you were talking about, and it's this sort of complicated race and class interaction. So, you were pointing out that that under apartheid, the white workers were better off than the black workers, right? That even the lowest paid, if I heard you correctly, even the lowest paid white workers were in a better position economically, materially than the sort of highest paid black workers and so on. But I just wondered, that's compatible with the possibility that the white working class was not benefiting from apartheid, was in fact harmed by it, in that maybe they would have been better off if there hadn't been apartheid, because if there had been a unified working class, especially if the black workers were a majority, were a much larger group, so that you have a much stronger working class that's sort of defending its interests together. It may be that all the working class would have been better off, including the white working class, than they were under apartheid, even if the white workers were better off than the black workers under apartheid, right? So it can be, I know it's, my understanding of the discipline of history is that the very doing of counterfactual history is controversial and so on. So, but I don't know if there's anything you could say about whether that seems possible or plausible, or does that make sense?
Well, I think in theory, yeah, I mean, those who wanted to challenge apartheid, especially certain trade unionists coming at this problem from a Marxist perspective, did want to unite workers across race and saw that apartheid is actually very much constructed because of capitalism and naturally flowing from, it was kind of like a natural response flowing from capitalism in the first place. And so if you're looking at it through that lens, then absolutely there were movements in South Africa that saw kind of this theory that understood apartheid as potentially racial capitalism, and therefore understood racism and capitalism as necessarily linked. And overthrowing apartheid therefore required an overthrow of capitalism more broadly. And that therefore unions and workers should not necessarily advance and support the liberation struggle, but should actually support the workers' struggle. And that struggle itself, kind of from a workerist perspective, should be focused on workers in the workplace and less focused on liberation and on questions of race. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's essentially how people at the time understood, certain activists at the time understood the problem of apartheid. And this absolutely, like, there were activists and trade unionists who were thinking in these broader class unity terms, to kind of cite the name of your podcast here, and were, you know, did agree that apartheid actually doesn't serve the interest of anyone in the working class, even if that includes white workers themselves. But of course, that's not exactly how it played out more broadly. It was very difficult for white workers and Black workers to kind of form alliances because the apartheid state divided them along these racial lines, which I'm happy to kind of dive into in more detail as well. But essentially, because to kind of not to challenge your counterfactual, but just I think because of the draconian nature of the apartheid state, and the way that it operated less in the interest of unity amongst the classes and sought to divide workers into distinct and opposing racial categories, made this type of unity really difficult to achieve.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think a couple things that make the situation in South Africa very different from that of the United States is the white population was like a small minority. I'm looking at the government of South Africa website right now, which says that the Black African population is 81.4%. So that, assuming that's like roughly what it was, in the past few decades, that would require a very small minority, racial minority to have dominance. And not one that's native either. So it seems to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that the major class forces driving the apartheid regime are a white or almost fully white Afrikaners, land and capital owning elite, and multinational corporations who benefit from very cheap Black labor for material resource extraction. Would you agree with that, or would you add anything or change anything about that? Those seem to be the major forces in my mind, at least, as given for what you've described so far.
Yeah, the only thing I would maybe add is just there's also a small English speaking population. So the white population is divided between Afrikaners and English speaking Anglos, and there are also, some disagreements between those two populations as well, but by and large, they do mutually benefit from apartheid. So
I wanted to ask you, a lot of your research centers around a figure named Reverend Leon H. Sullivan and the Sullivan Principles and the Vihan Commission. So he seems to be a very polarizing figure in South African politics. So could you talk to us about him and what about his legacy in South African history?
sure, he absolutely is a very polarizing figure as you described him. And I think a lot of it has to do with sort of a misunderstanding of his broader impact on not only South Africa, but also US race relations and the US civil rights movement more broadly. So his interest in South Africa developed out of his interest in uh, job training programs within the United States and kind of economic development in Africa as a continent. So this is kind of the trajectory of Leon Sullivan's career. I would, if I'm trying to kind of place the Sullivan Principles, they're one of his, I would say, later initiatives, and kind of build on some of his earlier work from, opportunities industrialization centers, which, just to give an example, this is a war on poverty program that focused on job training for Black youth in cities, specifically Philadelphia, which is where Leon Sullivan lived and worked as a preacher for Zion Baptist Church. So he which is one of the largest churches in Philadelphia. He ultimately became the first Black board member of General Motors in the early 70s, which at the time, this is sometimes I think, people thought that GM solely promoted him to at least signal that they were addressing some of the racial inequities in the United States within their operations in the United States. Um, and perhaps that, very well could be true. But after they did promote him, he became a controversial figure by actually speaking out vocally against apartheid in South Africa and calling for GM to actually leave the country, to fully disinvest. And at the time, this is 1971 or so. This was very controversial. And he received a lot of backlash from executives, from the board itself. And because of some of that backlash, he slowly backtracked on his policy of disinvestment and kind of tempered it and made it a little bit more presentable to corporate executives. And that's how we ended up with the Sullivan principles. So he never envisioned um, this kind of constructive engagement model that allowed companies to stay in South Africa if they improved their business practices. He actually initially wanted them to fully disinvest. He didn't think it was ethical for companies like GM to even operate in South Africa. So I think what I do with my work is I'm trying to kind of contextualize him and understand that um, as the first Black board member of General Motors, he obviously was operating in this really kind of constrained environment that, with that first experiment in calling for disinvestment, he obviously failed and received a lot of pushback. So he had to kind of moderate his stance and do what he reflects in his memoirs. Like he basically did what he could to, within this limited framework, to advance the livelihoods of Black workers in South Africa. And so that's how we ultimately end up with the Sullivan Principles. And the Sullivan Principles are rightly critiqued for a number of reasons. One being that they're voluntary. I think that's one of the most obvious critiques. He was very fearful that businesses would never sign on or support them if they were made mandatory or tied to the US government, mostly because companies didn't want to interfere in the sovereignty of other nations. And that was on principle kind of a breaking point. He decided that the code had to remain voluntary if it were to have any impact at all. Another major critique is that the code, the evaluations of the code were actually done by the companies themselves and were therefore not to be trusted because a company could perhaps skew some of the data. So those are just a few of the very reasonable critiques of the code. Ultimately, because businesses saw them as controversial and because a lot of businesses never even really signed on to them in the first place, if you're looking at kind of not historians of business ethics, but like from the perspective of just management and business, the code was always seen as actually really radical. But then if you're looking at it from the perspective of the anti-apartheid movement, it's seen as being weak and actually prolonging apartheid. So that's where Leon Sullivan largely fits into the broader narrative. And I'm happy to explain a little bit more about his background, but I think he obviously remains a controversial figure because he continues to invest in these principles even when the anti-apartheid movement comes out against them in the 1980s and says that, no, we actually need to call for full corporate disinvestment. We can't just, it's unethical to remain in South Africa while Black people are being killed in large numbers. And this is being televised on, internationally on TV. So this really haunts the legacy of the code, the fact that Sullivan was still kind of doubling down in this approach that is quickly becoming outdated and weak in the grander narrative of anti-apartheid resistance more broadly.
Okay, so Reverend Sullivan was an American civil rights activist and who was brought in by GM. And so it seems like he doesn't have a very straightforward connection to the sort of the bottom up anti-apartheid movement and the disinvestment movement. But I think I should ask you, just backing up a little bit, uh, what were the main avenues of resistance, of anti-apartheid resistance? Was it youth societies, or was it labor unions? Was it political parties like the Nelson Mandela African National Congress? What would you describe as the organic bottom up anti-apartheid response?
Yeah, so there, I would say historians tend to divide the anti-apartheid struggle into two camps, one being the internal movement against apartheid, so the movement from within South Africa itself, as well as the external movement against apartheid, so the movement emanating, from the United States, the UK, and globally. And so what I'm doing in my work is I'm trying to kind of infuse this understanding of kind of the salience of the internal movement and its broader impact, which I think is often downplayed sometimes in narratives that privilege the global struggle, and things like economic sanctions, for example, as being what undermined apartheid. I'm trying to ultimately show that workers, unionists, even the African liberation movements really played a key role in challenging apartheid in a way that made sanctions ultimately effective, because they created a context where sanctions could confront a weakened South African state. So, to give you a few examples of some of the movements, obviously the ANC comes to mind, the party of Nelson Mandela. It's still the governing party of South Africa today. So, I would say this is the most famous movement against apartheid. And the ANC, it's during the apartheid era, beginning in 1961 to 1964, was kind of gradually banned from the country and forced to operate in exile. So it's illegal to be a member of the ANC. And Nelson Mandela in 1964 is sent to prison, where he remains for 27 years. So that's why Nelson Mandela doesn't really appear too much in some of my work, because I'm focused on the 1970s and the 1980s, when he is predominantly imprisoned on Robben Island. So the struggle is stymied in this period, forced to operate in exile. Its leaders are jailed or banned, and the movement inside of South Africa is facing immense repression. That is where the kind of external movement comes in. The ANC sets up these outposts in other countries, such as the UK and the United States, Tanzania, Zambia, for example, where it is able to kind of operate in exile and work to kind of gain this global support against apartheid more broadly during this period. In the United States, there are a number of proliferating movements against apartheid, some coming from church groups, others coming from students, and then also just a number of kind of grassroots movements that are really a conglomerate of organizations and kind of civic organizations more broadly. So a few examples of movements that I think are quite important are the American Committee on Africa, as well as Trans Africa. These are kind of two various, in the Free South Africa movement, that I think had a pretty major impact on building support against apartheid in the United States, making people aware of the violence of apartheid. And then, of course, if we're thinking kind of back to South Africa again, during this time, during the 1970s and the 1980s, again, the period that I focus on most in my work, you see the actual growth of trade union movements within the country, where workers are able to build incremental power from the shop floor and really challenge management and the apartheid state in ways that come as a great shock to the apartheid state, but also really show that workers are able to leverage power through the workplace, by kind of withholding things like their labor. And ultimately, all this culminates in the rise in 1985 of one of the largest trade union federations, still in operation today, actually, which is COSATU in South Africa, that really brings together various forces against apartheid that had previously more or less disagreed for various reasons. Ultimately, this organization, along with civil society groups like the United Democratic Front, again, I know I'm just dropping a lot of names at you right now, but I think all these organizations played a really major role in challenging apartheid within South Africa and globally. And, I hope that by kind of showing you the variety of organizations that were able to mount a challenge to apartheid, you'll hopefully understand that this movement was not a monolith. It consisted, of everyday actors as well as, perhaps prominent congressmen, as well as, relatively wealthy white trade unionists in South Africa. So I think, again, there's quite a variety. And ultimately, what allowed it to cohere was just the general repulsiveness of apartheid. And that ultimately led to, it was one of the factors, all these movements working together and challenging the system led to apartheid's eventual demise in 1994.
Eric?
Yeah, I wondered if you could just comment on specifically the strategy of divestment and how that was utilized against apartheid, and how would you assess the efficacy of that as a strategy?
Right. So this is a question that I think animates one of what I define as my second book project, which is going to be a study of economic sanctions against South Africa and kind of its broader impact on the ground. So divestment was a strategy that was advanced and advocated for by the ANC and was adopted by anti-apartheid activists in places like the United States and the UK. And essentially, activists called for companies or called for the divestment of funds that were tied to companies related to South Africa in any capacity. Perhaps banks that gave loans to South Africa, organizations that had operations in South Africa, or really just any sort of tie to the country at all. So by advocating for divestment, these activists, so again, like the ACOA, the American Committee on Africa that I cited previously, they were hoping that companies would ultimately disinvest from the country, that enough pressure would make it such that it would no longer be profitable for companies to remain, and that they would therefore fully disinvest, and that would therefore put pressure on the apartheid regime. So as a strategy, divestment, it's fairly complicated. I think some of my work challenges it to some extent just because from the perspective of some South African workers, divestment did create a situation that made life worse for some of the workers. It perhaps when the company did disinvest, it wasn't done ethically. Some workers did lose their jobs, did lose their pensions. So what I'm doing with my work to some extent is kind of complicating the narrative and showing that divestment, while a largely successful tactic, did have some negative impacts on the ground. I think this is kind of true for a number of different cases. If we're looking at sanctions today, for example, I mean, there are negative human impacts that I think sometimes get ignored when sanctions are just kind of carelessly applied. And so that's kind of my motivation for trying to disentangle some of the existing or some of the ways we currently understand sanctions and divestment, boycotts more broadly.
It's interesting because I think sanctions as a tool have a very spotty history of effectiveness. And I think most major examples of sanctions just clearly didn't work or don't work. And South Africa is one example of sanctions that is pointed to as an example of when sanctions did work or when sanctions could work. And uh, so it seems like you think that sanctions made some role. So there's that view that sanctions in South Africa are, an example of when sanctions could work. Another view is that well, the movement for anti-apartheid, it was already so strong, it was only a matter of time before it would happen. And so we can't give credit to the sanctions. It didn't do anything. It was just sort of a coincidence that when sanctions were applied, the apartheid regime fell soon after. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that ultimately the narrative that sanctions were what toppled the apartheid regime, while there's some truth that it did play a role, I think that's somewhat damaging to the role played by internal actors and movements against apartheid and some of the work that activists, workers, and trade unionists were really doing on the ground at the time that kind of created a situation where apartheid could be understood globally and hence challenged. I think my issue with the sanctions argument is that the sanctions applied by the United States were a watered down version of what was initially opposed, anyways, and they also came rather late in the broader struggle against apartheid. So, apartheid's implemented formally in 1948. There are calls for sanctions almost immediately. At the UN, and the United States continues to veto things like arms embargoes and any form of mandatory economic sanctions until they eventually pass mandatory arms embargo in the late 70s, and then sanctions weren't imposed until 1986 after they were again watered down and somewhat reduced. So I think that's how I understand the argument. I think sanctions obviously were one factor amongst many, but I think in kind of privileging sanctions as what really toppled apartheid is problematic just because it sort of discounts the work that was already being done by people living apartheid on a day-to-day basis and kind of says that, oh, it was just because of the West that apartheid fell, which I think is a very simplistic narrative. I think most historians aren't, necessarily advancing that case, but I think that, by fully and only privileging kind of the external movement against apartheid, kind of going back to what I said earlier about there's the internal and the external wings. If you focus only on economic sanctions and their broader impact, then that kind of discounts what's happening within South Africa and things that workers and trade unionists, for example, had already done to make the system less sustainable by the late 1980s. And then, of course, you have like sanctions being opposed in 1986 by the United States, but apartheid doesn't end until 1994 anyways. So, there's a long kind of protracted and very violent struggle that actually unfolds between 1986 and 1994. Sanctions aren't imposed and apartheid ends immediately.
One thing that I find really confusing about the disinvestment movement is, to me, disinvestment means, you're pulling out and you're effectively laying off a lot of workers. So I sort of struggle to understand why unions would support sanctions, disinvestment, as a tool. Uh, why do you think that unions and the workers' movement or factions of it supported sanctions and disinvestment?
No, it's a really good question. I think I remember you asking me something similar during my presentation, and so I I think a lot of it does have to do with this symbolism versus kind of materialism debate, where symbolically uh, supporting sanctions meant support for African liberation because groups like the ANC, as I said, had long advocated for sanctions. And the ANC had grown in popularity on a global level by the late 1980s. And it was, if you oppose sanctions, even as a worker, or trade unionist within South Africa, you could be seen as opposing African liberation, and the ANC, which was not a popular stance more broadly. So a lot of it, I think, was possibly symbolic in that way, and workers and trade unions were willing. Many were on record as just saying that they're willing to sacrifice, and they're willing to suffer job loss. They're willing to suffer and increase poverty in the short term if that means that they can ultimately achieve their end goal, which is liberation. So, of course, not everyone adhered to this, but that was the argument that a lot of workers and unionists that did back sanctions legislation were advancing. I think a lot of times they also thought that they might be able to work with the companies to ensure that disinvestment was done ethically. Not always the case, but that didn't always happen. But that was something that I think a lot of the unions hoped they could, force into existence in some way.
Martin.
A question that I had about one of the two pieces of yours that we read focused on the role of, or at least a big part of it was about how labor unions in the US played a role, right, in supporting labor actions in South Africa, supporting the unions in South Africa, unionization efforts, and so on. And I thought there was lots of fascinating stuff there. And one question that occurred to me was, I just thought the sort of about the timing of these events. Standard story that one hears all the time about how some people want to say that Carter was the first neoliberal American president, but a standard story as well. Thatcher in Reagan in 80 or 80, this is the beginning of neoliberalism, and one feature of that is the crushing of labor unions and a decline in unionization levels in countries like the US and so on. And some of the story that you tell in one of the pieces about how unions in the US were helping out the unions in South Africa, partly by taking industrial action in the US. Some of that's taking place in the early 80s. So insofar as those US labor union actions were effective, it seems like they had, they were able to do some stuff despite what might have been going on in terms of the crushing of labor union power and so on, right? So is it that, yes, their power was diminishing, but they still had enough to do some things that could help out the South African labor unions? Or is it that most of the most effective things they did were really sort of in South Africa, so to speak, rather than in the US, so that even though their power in the US was getting diminished, that didn't inhibit them too much when it came to doing stuff that was helpful in South Africa? Just a question about the interplay of those two timelines, as it were.
Yeah, this is a question I get quite a lot, actually, just because, again, of the time period that I focus on, the 1970s and the 1980s, and how this story of worker challenges to apartheid kind of is layered on top of the rise of neoliberalism in the US, and globally. So I see the workers' movement against apartheid in a global context as really challenging, and an effort for workers to kind of push back against the rise of neoliberalism, and to really challenge the Reagan administration more broadly. So, I mean, I think they saw Reagan as kind of an evil force. He's also actively supporting the National Party in South Africa while crushing unions in the United States. So I think it's very obvious, this kind of connection between these two forces. So what workers in sort of challenging apartheid and making the worker struggle in South Africa, also their own struggle, are able to, I think, kind of really, really challenge apartheid, but also neoliberalism more broadly, and even really challenge some of the forces of globalization, as we discussed a bit earlier, because some of the workers in the United States understand that as they're losing ground in the United States, part of that is their jobs getting kind of outsourced globally to workers that get paid much less and completely unfair wages on a global level. So they see these forces as connected, and if they're not getting, if they're kind of losing ground, they being the American workers on a domestic level, they kind of see that in conversation with South African workers who are being exploited by the same U.S. companies that are also exploiting them at home. So this dovetails nicely with the global struggle against apartheid, which in the United States really went to great efforts to bring in trade unions and workers in the local community. So there's a number of anti-apartheid movements that were very local in scope, had local branches. They weren't distanced from the trade union movements in kind of their locales. So I think a lot of this kind of broadening of the anti-apartheid struggle, bringing in the working class, bringing in trade unions, not only like bolstered the trade union movement in the United States and kind of gave it this lifeline during the era of neoliberalism, but it also really strengthened the anti-apartheid movement. So therefore, I kind of see this as being a lesson for both worker organizers today, but also social movements more broadly that often tend to kind of be disconnected from the working class, sometimes don't really bring in the local community or workers more broadly. Just to give an example, like even at Yale here, there was an anti-apartheid movement mostly run by kind of the student groups within the American Committee on Africa. A lot of their rallies brought in speakers from the United Auto Workers, as well as some of the locals here in New Haven that were working on Yale's campus. So this was not a movement that was disconnected. It was a movement that tried to bring in as many wings as possible to really challenge the status quo.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting, and it also kind of leads into another question I had, which what you were just saying now, at least in part answers this, I think, but it'd be interesting to hear a little more about it if there is more you can say. So, the conflict, sort of what was going on in South Africa under apartheid, and you've got Black workers wanting to unionize and so on and so on. It can be, you can see obviously a conflict along racial lines there, obviously, but there's also a framing in terms of a conflict between workers and bosses or capital or the ruling class, and then also in the piece that I was asking about before, there's the framing of human rights violations, right? And so these are sort of three different, not necessarily incompatible, but three different ways of framing what's going on. And I'm wondering which of these ways of framing things predominated. I mean, the big question would be amongst like all the different parties involved, but that's too big a question. So maybe at least just for the American labor unions, for example, that were trying to intervene, what you were saying just now suggested that they were at least some of the time seeing it as a kind of conflict, as a class conflict, right? But yeah, was that just mixed in with thinking about it in terms of human rights violations, thinking about it in racial terms? Did one of these really predominate?
I feel like I'm not going to give a very satisfactory answer to this. I think it was very much a bit of both, at least with the kind of the struggle being divided along racial lines and class lines. I think certainly if we're looking at the perspective of workers and trade unionists in the United States, they obviously didn't all fully understand how apartheid functioned. I mean, I explained it, at the beginning of this podcast, but it's like a very complex system. And so I think a lot of workers, even though they did, sometimes receive guest speakers from South Africa, visiting workers, visiting trade unionists, encounter these voices. Even when those types of activists visited the US, they often did try to kind of not water down apartheid, but explain it in ways that would make sense for an American audience, which often did entail kind of simplifying everything along racial lines to some extent, and not necessarily fully explaining the class conflict. But part of my argument is that these workers kind of through their shared understanding of themselves as workers, be it workers in South Africa or the United States, were able to advance a more united front against apartheid, and a front that transcended borders. So I think a lot of the understanding, the way they understood South Africa was through a racial lens, but their connections to the workplace in South Africa were kind of drawn through their understanding of themselves as working class individuals and as workers, kind of first and foremost. So again, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I think I see it obviously being a little bit of both, just because race and class are so intertwined in this broader struggle against apartheid.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. Thank you.
It does seem that it all the perspectives we get about South Africa are come from some sort of political perspective. It's like a very politically charged topic. One way to understand the anti-apartheid movement, I mean, this was this took place at the same time as the Cold War and as the same place at the same time that other countries were decolonizing from Western imperialism. So one way to understand the anti-apartheid movement was sort of an anti-imperialist and by extension anti-American movement, and also as a communist movement, which sought to develop against Western capitalism. One term I've heard, or I've read used by members of the African National Congress, was white monopoly capital. So pitched very much along this sort of very radical framing. And so some have said that sort of this part of the apartheid movement has been whitewashed from contemporary American narratives. Would you agree with that, or what do you think about that?
What part of the movement are you saying is kind of whitewashed? Just to clarify.
So the anti-imperialist, anti-American, and communist elements of it.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, this is a huge problem that I think I hope I try to kind of address in some of my scholarship. So some elements of the struggle, specifically with regards to the ANC and how it's been historically understood as an organization, its alignment, with organizations like the South African Communist Party, is misunderstood, as well as the armed wing of the ANC, which is something I didn't really delve into so much in my introduction, but that element of the struggle against apartheid is often kind of downplayed or forgotten or just generally misunderstood more broadly. It's because the ANC did ultimately form an armed wing and mounted a number of kind of cross-border challenges to the apartheid regime. This is another element that I guess I would classify as an arm of the external movement against apartheid more broadly. And it played a major role in making South Africa ungovernable and at least instilling a lot of fear in kind of the white minority regime's mind. So absolutely, I think these are just a few examples of elements of the movement that do get kind of whitewashed or kind of misrepresented in the broader narrative more broadly. So by kind of, again, infusing this broader kind of holistic understanding of apartheid and the struggle against apartheid into this narrative that tends to kind of privilege people like just Nelson Mandela and people like Desmond Tutu, or just like some of these kind of magnanimous figures that while they played a major role, were actually much more complicated, and were tied to organizations that have a past that is often misrepresented in the media and histories more today.
Cool. Well, I think we're getting to the end of time. So I want to respect your time. Eric, Martin, if you have any final questions. I have one about the contemporary events, but I wanted to get to you before. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, if we could just get some of your thoughts on contemporary events. South Africa is part of the BRICS, which is uh, always on the news these days because of de-dollarization and this movement to of the the, the Eastern sort of the non-Western world becoming more monetarily independent from the United States. We also have a new administration here, and the informal vice president, you could say, is Elon Musk, somebody um, whose family made a lot of money. I hear from the diamond mines of South Africa. I, are you following current events? And as they relate to South Africa, is there anything you see interesting that relates back to South Africa's history as an apartheid regime, or what can you say um, about the current events you see unfolding?
Sure. So I think to kind of connect everything to, back to history and back to what I study more broadly in my own work, what I started this presentation with, or this podcast with, was this Natives Land Act that I mentioned. That was 1913, really began this process of forced relocation and like total and complete segregation along racial lines in South Africa. And the legacies of this act and the various legal tenets of apartheid, still are firmly implanted on South African society today. And, as someone who's visited there multiple times for research trips and, has traveled throughout the country, the legacies of apartheid are just very keenly felt today. I mean, if you were to visit yourself, you would obviously witness what looks kind of like a new form of apartheid to some extent. Perhaps, a less violent form. There's not, some legal structures that mandate apartheid, but there's still a form of racial capitalism that does kind of uh, lead to a permanent underclass. And what you have in South Africa today is 60, I think around 60% of the Black population does live in poverty, whereas only 1% of the white population lives in a similar state of poverty. So as you can see, inequality still falls along these racial lines. There's been some evening, at least on the top 10% between Black and white South Africans, but the situation's still really dire. A lot of people still live in kind of the same sort of segregated areas that they, grew up in under apartheid. So this is all to say that colonialism, apartheid, all these things have a much longer history that still affects South African society today. And a number of people are still grappling with and trying to understand how South Africa can best move past some of these really haunting policies from 30 plus years ago. So this is the general challenge that is facing South Africa. A lot of this has to do with land and the fact that the ANC did not challenge or really force much land redistribution in the aftermath of apartheid. And so people from the left critique the ANC for not redistributing enough land. The ANC had an early goal of redistributing 30% of mostly farmland to Black South Africans who were denied access or forcibly removed from the land during apartheid. And the goal was to accomplish that within 5 years. The goalpost has continually been moved to the extent that they still haven't reached the 30% mark. And where we are now is the current ANC governing party, which is actually governing in coalition at the moment with the Democratic Alliance Opposition Party. They did pass a bill that calls for land redistribution with some instances of potential non-compensation again, but this has been, I think the wording has allowed for a lot of misinterpretation, including by the president of the United States and Elon Musk, who is a white South African born in South Africa. He benefited greatly from apartheid. He is from an Afrikaner family, and working alongside Trump, they were able to take advantage of this situation, this new land expropriation bill, as well as South Africa's support for Gaza at the ICJ, in addition to the alliance between South Africa and Iran. And so a number of these factors, kind of a confluence of factors, have really contributed to what we now have as the executive order from the Trump administration that, amongst other things, calls out South Africa for this land expropriation bill, which they claim is forcibly seizing land from white South Africans, which instead of saying white South Africans, they say Afrikaners specifically, which doesn't account for all of the white South Africans anyways. It's a specific ethnic group within South Africa, and asked for the United States to relocate Afrikaners who were victims of what they call a genocide of white Afrikaners in South Africa, while the United States also temporarily halted its own refugee resettlement program a few weeks ago. So this is the context that I think we're dealing with at present. I don't know if there have been any updates since then, but the executive order, from at least what I can see, the South African side, is actually served to unite South Africans. The president, Ramaphosa, has been able to use it as a way to rally around the flag or call for South Africans to kind of support each other against foreign interference in kind of their own livelihoods. So I think the effect has been not exactly what Donald Trump and Elon Musk were hoping for. It's actually brought South Africans who are quite divided politically closer together, and to kind of show a united front against the United States and what they see as kind of Donald Trump's overreach and Elon Musk's, I guess, attempt to kind of exacerbate existing racial tensions within the country. But all this is, of course, rooted in the legacies of apartheid, all stemming from acts that were implemented more than a century ago. So it's a very, very complex situation. I'm still trying to make sense of it, frankly, to see. I don't really know what the end goal is with this, but seems to be a part of, from my understanding, kind of broader opposition to South Africa's involvement, as you said, with BRICS, and kind of turning away from America more broadly.
Before we finish, I wanted to know, for our viewers, where can they find you in your work? Do you have a Twitter or a website? Anything?
Yes, no, I do. I'm on Twitter at Mattie C Webb, MattiEC, and then WEBB. And then I believe my website's also the same, just mattiecwebb.com. So you can find me there. I've been tweeting a little bit about the most recent executive order. Yeah, I have no idea how to predict the future here, but follow along for more insight.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much.